What happens when Hollywood's most unpredictable comedian completely loses control on live television? It only took 43 seconds for a friendly conversation to explode into the most shocking meltdown daytime TV has ever witnessed. Before we dive into this absolute chaos, hit that subscribe button right now. We deliver daily videos exposing Hollywood's darkest scandals. And trust us, you won't want to miss what's coming next. Last night's episode of The Kelly Clarkson Show was supposed to be a fun, light-hearted celebration of comedy and creativity. Jim Carrey, the legendary actor known for his wild energy, rubber-faced expressions, and unpredictable personality, was scheduled to talk about his art, his decades-long career, and his latest creative projects that had been generating buzz online. Kelly had been promoting the episode all week on social media and during her other shows, telling her audience how genuinely excited she was to sit down with one of her childhood heroes, someone whose movies had shaped her sense of humor growing up. The studio audience was packed wall to wall, with fans who'd grown up watching his movies, people who loved his humor and his completely unique view of the world. There were fans wearing Ace Ventura shirts, people holding signs with quotes from The Mask, genuine longtime admirers who'd been waiting years to see him in person. Nobody, absolutely nobody, expected what was about to unfold over the next several minutes. The show started perfectly normal, exactly like any other episode. Kelly came out with her usual bright smile and that infectious energy that had made her such a successful talk show host. She was wearing a beautiful outfit, looking polished and professional. She welcomed everyone to the show with her characteristic warmth, chatting easily with the audience, making them laugh with a quick joke about her morning. Then she introduced Jim with genuine enthusiasm in her voice, listing his incredible accomplishments, spanning multiple decades, talking about how his films like The Truman Show and Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind had made her laugh until she cried and also think deeply about life when she was younger. She spoke about his evolution as an artist, his recent ventures into painting and sculpture, his willingness to constantly reinvent himself. The audience went absolutely wild with applause and cheers as Jim walked onto the stage. He was wearing one of his typically colorful, slightly eccentric outfits that somehow only he could pull off. He was waving enthusiastically to the crowd, doing a little impromptu dance as he made his way across the stage to the interview area, pulling faces that got immediate laughs. Everything seemed absolutely great, exactly what everyone had hoped for. They sat down and started talking, settling into the comfortable chairs across from each other. The first few minutes were exactly what everyone expected from a Jim Carrey interview: pure entertainment. He was incredibly animated, using his whole body to tell stories, making exaggerated faces that had the audience roaring with laughter, doing different voices and characters, seemingly without any effort. Kelly was laughing genuinely, clearly having a great time, not just doing her professional host laugh, but really cracking up. They talked about his early days doing stand-up comedy in small clubs in Canada, about the struggling years before he made it big in Hollywood, when he was living in a van with his family. Jim told a hilarious story about auditioning for a commercial where he was supposed to pretend to eat a sandwich, but he got so into the performance that he accidentally knocked over an entire table full of props, sending fake food flying everywhere while the casting directors just stared at him in stunned silence. Kelly was absolutely cracking up, wiping tears from her eyes, and the audience was eating up every word. He did an impression of the confused casting director that had people doubled over laughing. Everything felt warm and fun and exactly right. They spent a good amount of time reminiscing about his iconic movie roles. Kelly asked him about filming The Mask and whether wearing all that makeup was as uncomfortable as it looked. Jim launched into another funny story about the prosthetics and how he'd sometimes forget he was wearing them and try to eat lunch, only to remember halfway through that his face was covered in green latex. The audience loved it. They talked about Dumb and Dumber, and Jim did a quick impression of Lloyd Christmas that got massive applause. Kelly mentioned that she'd watched Liar Liar about 100 times and could quote half the movie. Jim seemed genuinely touched by that, thanking her for the support over the years. Everything was going so well that the producers backstage were probably congratulating themselves on booking such a perfect guest. Then Kelly brought up his art, transitioning smoothly from comedy to his more recent creative pursuits. Over the past several years, Jim had become increasingly focused on painting and sculpture, moving away from acting to dedicate serious time and energy to visual art. He'd been creating politically charged pieces that made strong, sometimes controversial statements about society, current events, American politics, and the entertainment industry itself. His artwork had gained significant attention online, with some people praising his boldness and artistic vision, while others criticized his approach as too heavy-handed or preachy. Kelly mentioned that she'd been following his artistic journey on social media, that she'd seen some of his recent paintings and sculptures online, and had found herself really thinking about them, even the ones that made her uncomfortable. She said she wanted to talk about this side of him because it seemed like such an important part of who he was now, not just a hobby but a genuine passion and calling. She seemed genuinely interested in understanding this transformation, asking him about when he first knew he wanted to pursue art seriously, and what inspired him to start painting and sculpting with such intensity. Jim's demeanor shifted noticeably when the topic turned to his art. Not in a bad way at first, but you could see him becoming more serious, more contemplative, more thoughtful in a way he hadn't been during the comedy stories. The playful energy didn't disappear entirely, but it was tempered by something deeper. He started talking about how art had become much more than just a creative outlet for him. It had become a form of genuine therapy, a way to process and express feelings and ideas that didn't fit into comedy anymore, that couldn't be contained in jokes or funny faces. He spoke about how the world felt fundamentally different to him now than it had earlier in his career, darker and more complicated and more urgent. He talked about how he'd become deeply disillusioned with certain aspects of Hollywood and the entertainment industry, how he'd started to see the superficiality and emptiness in a lot of what he'd spent his life doing. He said making people laugh was beautiful and important, but at some point he'd realized he had more to say, deeper things to express that required a different medium. His paintings, he explained, allowed him to be raw and honest in ways that comedy sometimes didn't. Kelly was nodding along supportively, clearly trying to show she understood and respected this evolution in his career. She asked thoughtful follow-up questions about specific pieces he'd created, about the symbolism in his work, about how it felt to receive such mixed reactions from the public. But then she asked a question that would change everything, that would set off a chain reaction neither of them could control. She wanted to know if he thought his political art was actually making a real difference in the world, or if it was primarily preaching to people who already agreed with his viewpoint. She asked it gently, almost carefully, like she genuinely knew it might be a sensitive subject, but felt it was important enough to explore. She said she'd been thinking about this a lot in her own life, about the responsibility that comes with having a platform and a voice that reaches millions of people. She mentioned that she was curious about his thoughts because she'd seen some criticism online, people saying that celebrity political statements often didn't actually reach the people who most needed to hear different perspectives, that they mostly just got shared and celebrated by people who already held those views. She said it seemed like a real challenge for anyone trying to use art to create change, and she wondered how he thought about it, how he measured impact versus just expression. Jim's face changed dramatically. The warmth and openness that had been there moments before completely drained away, replaced by something guarded and defensive. The playful energy vanished entirely. He sat up straighter in his chair, his whole posture becoming more rigid, and asked her directly what exactly she meant by that question. His tone wasn't overtly aggressive yet, but it was noticeably sharper, more direct, with an edge that cut through the previously comfortable atmosphere. You could feel the mood in the studio shift immediately. Kelly, sensing the sudden change in energy, tried to clarify quickly. She said she absolutely wasn't criticizing his work or his intentions, that she thought what he was doing was brave and important. She was just genuinely asking about how he thought about reach and impact, how he measured whether his art was accomplishing what he hoped it would accomplish. She mentioned that she herself sometimes struggled with knowing when to speak out about social or political issues and when to stay quiet, wondering if her platform actually helped create understanding or if it just added more noise to an already chaotic conversation. She said it was something she thought about constantly, this balance between using your voice and being mindful of how and when you use it. Jim leaned forward. He said that was exactly the problem with modern celebrity culture. Everyone was so afraid of having a real opinion, so worried about offending someone or losing fans, that they ended up saying nothing meaningful at all. He said art and expression should make people uncomfortable sometimes, should challenge people's beliefs, should spark real conversation instead of just getting likes and shares from people who already think the same way. Kelly nodded, but then she pushed back a little. She said she understood that perspective, but didn't he think there was value in trying to build bridges instead of just making provocative statements? She mentioned that some of his recent paintings had been pretty harsh, pretty angry, and she wondered if that anger was productive or if it just made people defensive and less likely to listen. That's when things started to escalate. Jim's voice got louder. He said he was tired of being told to be nice, to be gentle, to sugarcoat his feelings about what he saw happening in the world. He'd spent his whole career making people laugh, making people feel good, and now that he was trying to say something real, something honest, people wanted him to soften it. He said Kelly had no right to question whether his anger was productive when she'd never had to deal with what he dealt with, never had to watch his career, his art, his entire life be picked apart by people who thought they knew better. Kelly looked taken aback. She said she wasn't trying to pick apart his life or his art. She was just asking questions, trying to have a conversation about something she found interesting and important. She said as a talk show host, part of her job was to ask thoughtful questions that reflected different perspectives, including questions that might be uncomfortable. Jim laughed, but it wasn't a friendly laugh. It was bitter and sarcastic. He said that was convenient, hiding behind the excuse of just asking questions, when what she was really doing was judging him. He said she'd invited him on her show under the pretense of celebrating his work, but what she actually wanted was to challenge him, to make him defend himself to her audience. The audience was getting uncomfortable now. People stopped laughing. The energy in the room had completely shifted from fun and lighthearted to tense and awkward. Kelly's smile had faded. She looked genuinely confused and hurt. She tried to explain that she hadn't invited him on to attack him. She'd invited him because she admired him, because she thought her audience would enjoy hearing from him, because she wanted to have a real conversation beyond just the usual promotional interview stuff. Jim shook his head. He said if she really admired him, she'd be supporting his right to express himself however he wanted, not questioning whether his methods were appropriate or effective. He said every artist throughout history who'd tried to say something meaningful had been told they were too angry, too controversial, too difficult. He wasn't going to apologize for having passion about things that mattered. Kelly's voice got firmer. She said nobody was asking him to apologize for having passion. She was simply trying to engage with his work on a deeper level, to understand his thought process. She said she'd asked similar questions to dozens of other guests who did political or social commentary through their art, and none of them had reacted like this. She said he was being defensive about a question that was meant to be thoughtful, not attacking. Jim stood up suddenly, not violently, but abruptly enough that it startled everyone. He said maybe the difference was that those other guests were used to playing the game, used to giving safe answers that made everyone comfortable. He said he'd come on her show thinking he could be honest, could be himself, but clearly that wasn't what she wanted. She wanted the funny Jim Carrey, the entertaining Jim Carrey, the Jim Carrey who made everything light and easy. Kelly stood up too. Her expression had shifted from hurt to frustrated. She said that wasn't fair at all. She'd given him plenty of time to talk about his art, to explain his perspective, to share whatever he wanted to share. All she'd done was ask one follow-up question about impact, and he'd turned it into this whole thing about her not supporting him or trying to censor him. She said he was putting words in her mouth and intentions in her heart that weren't there. Jim's voice got even louder. He said she didn't get to tell him what was or wasn't fair. He said she was sitting there in her comfortable talk show host chair, smiling her talk show host smile, asking her talk show host questions, and then acting surprised when someone gave her a real, unfiltered response instead of some rehearsed soundbite. He said this was exactly what was wrong with these shows. With this whole industry, everything had to be pleasant and palatable and safe. Kelly's face flushed. You could see she was getting angry now too, really angry. She said she'd been nothing but respectful to him from the moment he walked on stage. She'd praised his work, laughed at his stories, given him a platform to talk about whatever he wanted. And this was how he was thanking her? By accusing her of being fake and attacking her show in front of her own audience? Jim said if she thought she'd been respectful, she had a weird definition of respect. Respect would have been accepting his art for what it was without questioning whether it was effective enough or appropriate enough. Respect would have been trusting that he knew what he was doing with his own creative expression. Instead, she'd done what everyone in the media did, pretended to be supportive while actually undermining and second-guessing. The audience was dead silent. Some people looked shocked. Others looked uncomfortable, like they wanted to leave but couldn't. This had gone so far beyond a normal disagreement. This was two people who clearly saw the situation completely differently, and neither one was willing to back down or find middle ground. Kelly took a deep breath, clearly trying to compose herself. She said she was sorry he felt that way, but she completely disagreed with his interpretation of what had happened. She said she'd asked a legitimate question that came from a place of genuine curiosity, and he'd responded by attacking her character and her show. She said she'd interviewed hundreds of people, many of whom had controversial viewpoints or provocative art, and they'd managed to have productive conversations without it devolving into personal attacks. Jim grabbed his microphone and started pulling it off. His hands were shaking, whether from anger or adrenaline or both. He said maybe those people had been more willing to compromise their authenticity for the sake of a smooth interview. He said he'd spent too many years of his life being what other people wanted him to be, saying what other people wanted him to say, and he was done with it. He was done pretending that everything was fine, that polite conversation was more important than honesty. Kelly's voice rose. She said honesty was one thing, but what he was doing wasn't honesty. It was defensiveness and aggression. She said he'd come on her show and made assumptions about her intentions, accused her of things she didn't do, and now he was acting like she was the one who'd wronged him. She said she deserved better than that. Her audience deserved better than that. And frankly, he was being incredibly rude and unfair. Jim finally got his microphone off and held it in his hand. He looked at Kelly with something like disappointment mixed with anger. He said the fact that she was calling him rude for having a genuine emotional response just proved his point. Everyone wanted him to be entertaining, to be agreeable, to make them feel good. But the moment he showed real feelings, real frustration, real humanity, suddenly he was the problem. He was rude, he was difficult, he was too much. Kelly's eyes were bright, like she might cry from frustration, but her voice stayed strong. She said she wasn't calling him rude for having emotions. She was calling him rude for how he was treating her. There was a difference between being honest and being hurtful, between being passionate and being hostile. She said she'd opened her show to him, welcomed him warmly, and he'd twisted a simple question into a reason to attack everything about her and what she did. Jim set his microphone down on his chair. He said he wasn't going to stand there and be lectured about how to behave by someone who clearly didn't understand what he was trying to say. He said this whole conversation had confirmed everything he'd been feeling about talk shows, about mainstream entertainment, about the superficiality of it all. Everyone wanted depth until depth made them uncomfortable. Everyone wanted authenticity until authenticity challenged them. Kelly said that was such bullshit. Her voice cracked a little when she said it, emotion breaking through. She said she'd tried to have a real conversation with him, tried to engage meaningfully with his work, and he'd thrown it back in her face. She said he didn't get to come on her show, treat her like garbage, and then claim he was just being authentic. That wasn't authenticity. That was just being mean. Jim stared at her for a long moment. The studio was so quiet, you could probably hear people breathing. Then he said if she thought he was being mean, she had no idea what mean actually looked like. He said he'd been honest with her, which was more than he could say for most interactions he had in Hollywood. But clearly honesty wasn't welcome here. Kelly threw her hands up. She said fine. If that's how he saw it, then maybe he should leave. She said she'd tried to make this work, tried to understand where he was coming from, tried to fix whatever was broken in this conversation, but she was done. She was done being accused of things she didn't do. She was done being treated like the enemy for asking a thoughtful question. If he wanted to go, he should go. Jim nodded slowly. He said that was probably the first real thing she'd said this whole interview. At least now she was being honest about wanting him gone, instead of pretending everything was fine. He said he'd be happy to leave. He picked up his jacket from the back of his chair. Kelly's voice was shaking now, from anger, or hurt, or both. She told him he could walk out that door, but he should know that he'd burned a bridge here. She said she'd defended him to people who said he was difficult to work with, who said he was unstable, who said he'd become impossible. She'd believed in him, believed he was just misunderstood. But now she understood perfectly. He wasn't misunderstood. He was exactly what people said he was. That comment hit hard. You could see it in Jim's face. For a second, just a second, his expression softened, like maybe he realized how far things had gone. But then his jaw set again. He said if believing those things about him made her feel better about this situation, she could go ahead and believe them. He said he knew who he was, and he didn't need her validation or her approval. He started walking toward the side of the stage. His movements were quick, purposeful. He wasn't storming off in a rage, but he clearly wanted out of there. Kelly watched him go, her arms crossed, her expression a mixture of anger and something that looked like sadness. The audience didn't know whether to applaud or stay silent. Most of them just sat there in shock. Jim reached the edge of the stage and paused. He turned back for just a moment. He looked at Kelly, at the audience, at the cameras, capturing everything. Then, without saying another word, he walked off the stage and disappeared behind the curtain. The sound of his footsteps faded away, leaving nothing but heavy, uncomfortable silence in the studio. Kelly stood there for several long seconds. She looked shaken, like she couldn't quite believe what had just happened. Her hands were trembling slightly. She turned to the audience, opened her mouth like she was going to say something, then closed it again. Finally, she managed to speak. Her voice was quiet, strained. She said she was sorry they'd had to witness that. She said she'd tried her best to have a good conversation, but sometimes things just didn't go the way you hoped. A few people in the audience applauded, showing their support for her. Others just sat there, still processing. Kelly nodded, acknowledging the applause, but she looked tired. This wasn't how the show was supposed to go. This wasn't what anyone had wanted. What had started as an exciting opportunity to hear from one of comedy's biggest legends had turned into a confrontation about respect, authenticity, and the nature of honest conversation. Jim had felt attacked and misunderstood, his art and his intentions questioned in a way that triggered something deep in him. Kelly had felt blindsided and insulted, her genuine curiosity twisted into something accusatory by a guest who seemed determined to see the worst in everything she said. The argument had escalated from a simple question about art and impact into a full-scale battle about media, authenticity, and how we talk to each other. Jim had accused Kelly of being fake and superficial, of hiding behind her role as interviewer to judge him. Kelly had accused Jim of being defensive and hostile, of taking a thoughtful question and turning it into a personal attack. Neither one had been willing to give ground, to see the other's perspective, to find a way back to civil conversation. And now Carrey was gone. Having walked off the Kelly Clarkson show after one of the most intense confrontations in talk show history, leaving behind an audience full of confused fans and a host trying to figure out what had just happened to her show.